Street Fighter II. The World Warrior is a competitive fighting game originally released for the arcades in 1991. It is the second entry in the Street Fighter series and the arcade sequel to the original Street Fighter released in 1987. It is Capcom's 14th title that runs on the CP system arcade hardware. Street Fighter II improves upon the many concepts introduced in the first game, including the use of command-based special moves and a 6-button configuration, while offering players a selection of multiple playable characters, each with their own unique fighting style, and introducing a combo system and competitive multiplayer combat between two players. The success of Street Fighter II is credited for starting the fighting game boom during the 1990s, which inspired other game developers to produce their own fighting game franchises, popularizing the genre, and setting off a renaissance for the arcade game industry in the early 1990s. It was then ported to the Super Nintendo Entertainment System home console, for which it became a long-lasting system seller. Its success led to a sub-series of updated versions, each offering additional features and characters over previous versions, as well as several home versions. By 1994, the game had been played by at least 25 million Americans in homes and arcades. By 1995, gross revenues of Street Fighter II and Street Fighter II Champion Edition arcade machines had exceeded $2.312 billion. The video game console ports sold more than 14 million copies. The Super NES port of the original game sold 6.3 million units, making it Capcom's best-selling single consumer game software of all time until 2013 and remaining their best-selling game software on a single platform through to the present day. Gameplay. Street Fighter II follows several of the conventions and rules already established by its original 1987 predecessor. The player engages opponents in one-on-one close-quarter combat in a series of best 2 out of 3 matches. The objective of each round is to deplete the opponent's vitality before the timer runs out. If both opponents knock each other out at the same time or the timer runs out with both fighters having an equal amount of vitality left, then a double KO, or draw game, is declared and additional rounds will be played until sudden death. In the first Street Fighter II, a match could last up to 10 rounds if there was no clear winner. This was reduced to 4 rounds in Champion Edition and onward. If there is no clear winner by the end of the final round, then either the computer-controlled opponent will win by default in a single-player match or both fighters will lose in a 2-player match. After every third match in the single-player mode, the player will participate in a bonus stage for additional points. The bonus games includes a car-breaking event similar to another bonus round featured in Final Fight, a barrel-breaking bonus game where the barrels are dropped off from a conveyor belt on the top portion of the screen, and a drum-breaking bonus game where drums are flammable and piled over each other. Like in the original, the game's controls uses a configuration of an 8-directional joystick and 6 attack buttons. The player uses the joystick to jump, crouch and move the character towards or away from the opponent, as well as to guard the character from an opponent's attacks. There are 3 punch buttons and 3 kick buttons of differing strength and speed. The player can perform a variety of basic moves in any position, including grabbing, throwing attacks, which were not featured in the original Street Fighter. Like in the original, the player can perform special moves by inputting a combination of directional and button-based commands. Street Fighter II differs from its predecessor due to the selection of multiple playable characters, each with distinct fighting styles and special moves. Combos were also possible. According to IGN, the concept of combinations, linked attacks that can't be blocked when they're timed correctly, came about more or less by accident. Street Fighter II's designers didn't quite mean for it to happen, but players of the original game eventually found out that certain moves naturally flowed into other ones. This combo system was later adopted as a standard feature of fighting games, and was expanded upon in subsequent Street Fighter installments. Characters. The original Street Fighter II features a roster of 8 playable characters that could be selected by the player. The roster initially included Yu and Ken, the main characters from the original Street Fighter game, plus 6 new characters of different nationalities. In the single-player tournament, the player faces off against the other 7 main fighters, before proceeding to the final opponents, which are 4 non-selectable CPU-controlled boss opponents, known as the Grandmasters. Playable characters. Yu, a Japanese karateka, seeking to hone his skills. Honda, a sumo wrestler from Japan. Blanca, a beast-like mutant from Brazil who was raised in the jungle. Guile, a former USAF Special Forces operative from the United States, seeking to defeat the man who killed his best friend. Ken, Yu's rival and former training partner from the USA. Chun-Li, a Chinese martial artist who works as an Interpol officer, seeking to avenge her deceased father. Zangief, a pro wrestler from the USSR. Dalsim, a fire-breathing yoga master from India. CPU-exclusive characters. Balrog, an African-American boxer, designed with a similar appearance to Mike Tyson. Vega, a Spanish torero who wields a claw and uses a unique style of ninjutsu. Sagat, a Muay Thai kickboxer and former World Warrior champion from the original Street Fighter, who was scarred by Yu in the end of the previous tournament. Regional differences. With the exception of Sagat, the Grandmasters have different names in the Japanese version. The African-American boxer known as Balrog in the international versions was designed as a pastiche of real-life boxer Mike Tyson and was originally named M. Bison, while Vega and M. Bison were originally named Balrog and Vega respectively. When Street Fighter II was localized for the overseas market, the names of the bosses were rotated, fearing that the boxes' similarities to Tyson could have led to a likeness infringement lawsuit. This name change would be carried over to future games in the series. The characters in the Japanese version also have more than one win quote, and if the player loses a match against the CPU in the Japanese version, a random playing tip will be shown at the bottom of the continue screen. Marketing staff. For example, the name of Guile's fallen friend was changed from Nash to Charlie, since a staff member from Capcom USA felt that Nash was not a natural-sounding English name. Development. Although the original Street Fighter had not been very popular, Capcom began to make fighting games a priority after Final Fight was commercially successful in the United States. Yoshiki Okamoto recounted, "The basic idea at Capcom was to revive Street Fighter, a good game concept, to make it a better playing arcade game." About 35 to 40 people worked on Street Fighter II, with Noritaka Funamizu as a producer, and Akira Nishitani and Akira Yasuda in charge of the game and character design respectively. Funamizu notes that the developers did not particularly prioritize Street Fighter II's balance. He primarily ascribes the game's success to its appealing animation patterns. The quality of animation benefited from the developers' use of the CPS-1 hardware, the advantages of which included the ability for different characters to occupy different amounts of memory. For example, you could take up 8 MB and Zangief 12 MB. The game's development took 2 years. The game's combo system came about by accident. While I was making a bug check during the car bonus stage, I noticed something strange. Curious. I taped the sequence and we saw that during the punch timing, it was possible to add a second hit and so on. I thought this was something impossible to make useful inside a game, as the timing balance was so hard to catch. So we decided to leave the feature as a hidden one. The most interesting thing is that this became the base for future titles. Later we were able to make the timing more comfortable and the combo into a real feature. In SFII we thought if you got the perfect timing you could play several hits, up to 4 I think. Then we managed to place 8. A bug. Maybe. Noritaka Funamizu. The vast majority of the in-game music was composed by Yoko Shimomura. While Shimomura initially had reservations about doing the music for a fighting game, a genre of which she was not particularly fond, she soon came to enjoy working on the project and stated that while Breath of Fire was her personal favorite of the games she worked on while at Capcom, Street Fighter II was the most memorable. This was ultimately the only game in the series on which Shimomura worked, as she subsequently left the company for Square 2 years later. Isao, a Capcom newcomer, handled a few additional tracks for this game and subsequently became the main composer on the remaining Street Fighter II games. The sound programming and sound effects were overseen by Yoshihiro Sakaguchi, who had been the composer on the original Street Fighter ports. Super NES Street Fighter II was released for the Super Famicom on June 10, 1992 in Japan, which was followed by a North American release for the Super NES in August of the same year and a European release in December. It was the first game released on a 16 megabit cartridge for the SNES. Many aspects from the arcade versions were either changed or simplified in order to fit into the smaller memory capacity. This version also featured a secret code which would allow both players to control the same character in a match, which wasn't possible in the original arcade version. The second player uses the same alternate color palette introduced in Street Fighter II Champion Edition. The 4 Grandmasters are still non-playable, but they use their Champion Edition color palette if the code is entered. Other changes are as follows. The attract sequence, which featured 2 generic fighters fighting, was removed. Some of the voice samples played when characters perform certain techniques or special moves were removed. The pitch of a character's voice when they perform a special move differs depending on the strength level. The higher the strength level, the higher the pitch. The bonus stage, in which the player must destroy stacks of flammable oil drums, was replaced by a stage in which the player must destroy a pile of bricks. The barrel-breaking bonus stage was also removed, and as a result, the bonus stages are now played after every 4 matches. The tunes of the soundtrack were not only arranged. The music that plays when a character is losing a match is arranged differently from the arcade version, since the same music is played but with the tempo raised. Tatsuya Nishimura, who had recently joined Capcom from TOSE, arranged the soundtrack for the SNES version, with assistance from Shimomura, Abe, and Sakaguchi. Some attacks were removed, such as Chun-Li's closed standing medium punch. The walking animation of the characters when retreating from an opponent is the same when advancing, only played in reverse. The voice countdown during the continue screen, as well as the reading of each country's name, were removed. Moreover, the font used during the continue screen is different as well. 2 of the elephants were removed from Dalsim's stage, leaving a total of 4. The 2 guitar players and other background characters were removed from Vega's stage. The palm tree in the foreground of Sagat's stage was removed. The blood splatter behind the versus text before each match was removed. The effect was added back in later console ports, and its color was changed to purple in Super Street Fighter II. The victory quotes for certain characters were altered. The visuals and script in some of the endings are a bit different from the arcade version. The upper and lower portions of the screen are covered by black bars, shortening the vertical length of the screen. This was done to compensate for the reduced size of the character sprites and make the change less noticeable to players. A versus mode was added for 2 players to play a series of matches, having the option each time to change their character, stage and handicap between matches. Home Computers US Gold released versions of Street Fighter II for various home computer platforms in Europe, namely, the Amiga, Atari ST, Commodore 64, PC, and ZX Spectrum. These versions were not released in any other region, except for the PC version, which also saw a release in North America. These versions suffered from numerous inaccuracies, such as missing graphical assets and music tracks, miscolored palettes, and lack of 6-button controls. As a result, these versions are filled with unusual peculiarities, such as Yu and Ken's Hadoken sprite being a recolored Yoga Fire and the title theme being used as background music for matches, while move properties are completely different. In the DOS version in particular, Dalsim ends up being the strongest fighter in the game due to his basic attacks having high priority over other characters. Game Boy. The Game Boy version of Street Fighter II was released on August 11, 1995 in Japan, and in September 1995 internationally. It is missing 3 of the original characters, although the remaining 9 are playable. The graphics, character portraits, and stages are based on Super Street Fighter II, although some moves from Super Street Fighter II Turbo are included as well. Same character matches are allowed, but because of the game's lack of color, distinguishing between 2 characters is not possible even on a Super Game Boy. Compilations. The original Street Fighter II was included along with Champion Edition and Hyper Fighting in the compilation Capcom Generation 5 for the PlayStation and Sega Saturn, which was released in North America and Europe under the title of Street Fighter Collection 2. All 3 games were also included in Capcom Classics Collection Volume 1 for the PlayStation 2 and Xbox, as well as Capcom Classics Collection Reloaded for the PlayStation Portable. Updated versions. Street Fighter II was followed by a series of updated versions, each refining the play mechanics, graphics, character roster, and other aspects of the game. The first was Street Fighter II Champion Edition, released for the arcades in 1992, which allowed players to control the 4 Grandmasters and same character matches. Following the release of Champion Edition, a wave of bootleg ROM chip upgrades for its arcade cabinets added new gameplay, prompting Capcom's official response with Street Fighter II Turbo Hyper Fighting during the same year, increasing the playing speed and giving some of the characters new special moves. Super Street Fighter II The New Challenges was released in 1993, which marked the change to the more advanced CP System 2, allowing for updated graphics and audio, while introducing 4 new characters. Super Street Fighter II Turbo was released in 1994 and was the last of the Street Fighter II releases for the arcades, which introduced powered-up special moves called Super Combos and added a new hidden character. All 5 Street Fighter II games have ported to various platforms, both in individual releases and in compilations. There have also been exclusive home versions such as Hyper Street Fighter II and Super Street Fighter II Turbo HD Remix. Other media and merchandise. The characters from the Street Fighter II video game became part of the G.I. Joe, a real American hero lineup in 1993, as Hasbro bought the toy rights to the characters. An unofficial South Korean animation titled Street Fighter was produced by Daiwon Animation in 1992 and features the cast of Street Fighter II. The Hong Kong movie Future Cops also featured a cast of Street Fighter characters. Street Fighter II was adapted into 2 different film adaptations in 1994, Street Fighter II, the animated movie, and an American-produced live-action film, simply titled Street Fighter, starring Jean-Claude Van Damme as Guile, Kylie Minogue as Cammy and Raul Julia as M. Bison. The live-action film incorporated the main cast of the video game and wrapped them into an action-adventure. Director Stephen E. D'Souza's take on the premise. I especially love films like The Longest Day, The Great Escape and The Guns of Navarone. What made those films great wasn't the random violence. It was the clear-cut struggle between forces of good and evil, leading to an ultimate showdown. There was also a U.S. Street Fighter cartoon, which followed a combined Van Damme movie and game series plot, and an unrelated anime titled Street Fighter Ⅱ, mostly thought as being a prequel to the event in the original game, featuring younger characters. A similar approach drove the script of the movie The Legend of Chun-Li.